So, excuse the Ross Matthews impression here, but you know that thing where you form a strongly held opinion about a particular subject and you stick by it over the years as you watch people wax and wane on it, and even as your own interest in the overarching subject fades, you still feel pretty strongly about it, and then when you finally decide to ask your channel members if they still want you to talk about it nearly a decade later, $1 billion studio decides to kneecap you halfway through your voting process by announcing a massive update that actually finally, maybe, addresses your opinion. It's real. It could happen to anyone. It happened to me. So every month I do a member's choice poll during the first 10 days of the month, and in February that poll included the topic, how Sombra ruined Overwatch's story. This video would have been about how, all those many years ago, a lot of people, probably not named Michael Chu, but definitely also at least one guy named Michael Chu, ruined the Overwatch story with Sombra, and it never really recovered. And to be very clear, I'm not saying this because I hate Sombra. She is absolutely my favorite Overwatch character and has been since she was finally unveiled at BlizzCon 2016. This is largely the result of spending most of the Sombra ARG delirious with mono and in and out of the hospital in Australia during what one could call a stressful period of my life, and I basically ended up trauma bonding with this character as a result. But regardless, I've mained her forever, I like her a lot, it's not like an anti-Sombra thing here. And I had figured at the time that this was a pretty safe bet to put in the polls because Overwatch's story barely ever meaningfully advances, and stuff related to Sombra specifically, especially the conspiracy, we'll get to that, basically never got touched over nearly a decade of this fucking game. Yeah, well, fuck me, right? Overwatch did their big overhaul midway through that poll, and while there are a few elements of that would have changed what I wanted to talk about, the biggest one was undoubtedly, honestly, Emre, for reasons we'll get to in a second. In spite of that, I do still believe that my core premise, that Sombra was what ruined Overwatch's story, holds up. It's just that maybe, potentially, it might finally be getting fixed. So let's talk about it. How did Sombra ruin Overwatch's story? And what does it mean in the context of current day Overwatch? Part 1. The beginning. So, in order to explain how Sombra broke everything, it is probably necessary to start with what she broke. When Overwatch first started out a decade ago, the story's premise was relatively straightforward. It was Overwatch versus Talon, with Overwatch being a former UN Peacekeepers-esque organization that fell from grace, and Talon being a terrorist organization that they're up against in the modern day. A major component of the story are the Omnics, a now sentient species of robots that humans invented, but which got a little tiny bit out of control when they got taken over by something, we'll get to that kind of, and then met Robot Jesus. That bit where they got out of control, known as the Omnic Crisis, is what created the conditions for Overwatch to be formed as humanity's last-ditch attempt to try and stop this fucking crisis. They brought in international forces led by the Americans because, of course, this game is still made by Americans, they will center themselves, and succeeded in stopping them. Then, over the years, controversies befell the organization, slowly turning them from the Golden Boys with the Saturday morning cartoons into a disgraced group of power-tripping thugs. Eventually, Overwatch was shut down. We are glossing over a lot here, but that part isn't super important for you to understand where we're coming from. When we joined the story, the only heroes we knew that were actively involved on either side were Winston and Tracer for Overwatch and Widowmaker and Reaper for Talon. Reaper attacked Winston in Gibraltar to steal information on the whereabouts of former Overwatch agents. Winston fought him off, then he recalled the Overwatch agents, which is when Tracer joined him. Reaper used to be part of Overwatch, and Widowmaker used to be the wife of an Overwatch commander before Talon kidnapped her, brainwashed her, and then sent her out to kill her own husband and also turned her blue. Back at the game's launch, there were 21 heroes, most of whom were scattered far and wide around the world. Mercy, Reinhardt, Soldier 76, Torbjorn, Genji, and Cassidy, then McCree, were all former Overwatch members who'd gone off and done their own thing after it fell apart. Mei was also kind of part of that group, but as a member of their environmentalist Eco Watchpoint in Antarctica. Farah, Zenyatta, Zarya, Symmetra, and Diva were, respectively, part of Helix Security in Egypt, the Shambhali Order in Nepal, Volskaya Industries in Russia, Vishkar in India, and the South Korean Mecha Squad, respectively. Basically one-off offshoots of the main story that didn't immediately tie into the main thing. Lucio was part of an informal Brazilian resistance against Vishkar in Rio, Bastion was a leftover from the Omnic Crisis just wandering around Europe, I guess, and Roadhog and Junkrat were part of an anti-Omnic group called the Junkers in the Australian outback. Hanzo was part of the Shimada clan in Japan, or was before he killed his brother Genji, except he didn't actually kill him, but they thought he did, so it still basically was treated like he killed him. That's a whole separate can of worms. But regardless, that was the state of play of the game's launch. A whole lot of characters scattered around, often with no direct connection to the main story at all, but we hoped they would find ways to rope them in. Then, post-launch, Ana was released as the first DLC hero. She had been a founding Overwatch member and was also Farah's mother, and that felt like a step in the right direction for, having a coherent story. However, fundamentally the story at this point was still Overwatch versus Talon, and that was a pretty straightforward conflict. Good guys versus bad guys, tale as old as time. Frankly, would have fit into those Saturday morning cartoons about Overwatch that existed in universe. At this point in the narrative, the timeline was honestly a little bit jumbled due to the lack of clarity on when stuff like the Omnic Crisis happened or when Overwatch fell. In the present day, we know that they were founded roughly 30 years ago and then won the war and entered their golden age. Then, about 10 years ago, they fell from grace, and after 5 years of controversy, were disbanded. The story at the time of Overwatch 1's launch was taking place about 5 years after that disbandment, and as of spring 2026, we're about 2-ish years past that point. To be clear, by and large, this isn't information we had back then, but it's useful for providing some context because otherwise I don't know how to explain when things were happening. A lot of the younger characters grew up in a post-crisis world, but still an Overwatch world. But the crisis itself happened a pretty long time ago. Prejudices against Omnics still run deep, and the damage of the crisis is seemingly still not fully fixed. However, the Omnics themselves weren't really an antagonistic faction. The two at launch, Zenyatta and Bastion, were good guys, or Bastion was kind of a neutral figure, I guess, but regardless, the only time we saw the story interacting with the Omnic stuff early on was when Tracer tried and failed to stop Widowmaker from Charlie Kirking Takara Mandata in King's Row. The Omnic Crisis was just the reason why Overwatch initially existed, not a current ongoing thing. The current conflict was Overwatch versus Talon. But then, Sombra. Part 2. The Incident. Sombra was introduced to the audience over the span of several months via an ARG where she, among other things, hacked into in-game maps like Volskaya Industries and Dorado. She was revealed to the audience at BlizzCon 2016, hacking into the presentation and kicking off the cinematic infiltration. This cinematic itself isn't really an issue. It adds Sombra to Talon, but also presents her as having some clear ulterior motives. She sabotages the mission so she has a chance to blackmail Katya Volskaya for personal gain. And that's something the story could probably handle. A bad guy with ulterior motives rather than some ideological commitment to this organization isn't really that far out of the story's reach. However, what really broke the story wasn't infiltration. It was Sombra's origin video, a 90-second video explaining her backstory that a lot of people probably don't even know exists. Like, it's pretty far back in YouTube's or in Overwatch's YouTube library at this point. She grew up in Mexico, orphaned by the crisis, and picked up hacking to get by as a child. She was very talented at it too, especially because nobody suspected the little girl and everyone underestimated her social manipulation abilities. And in the process, she formed a lot of connections with local gangs, including Los Muertos. But then, she went a little bit too far. She had been hacking corporations, governments, everyone, just for the thrill of it, and she accidentally caught the eye, pun intended, of, for lack of a better term, the conspiracy. The conspiracy is represented in this video as an eye icon that hacks into Sombra's system, compromising her fully. It's at this point that she erases her old self, Olivia Colomar, and becomes Sombra, hell-bent on not only continuing her work, but figuring out who exactly is behind the conspiracy. The really important bit for our purposes is this bit at the end here.
I'll find out who really runs the world. I'll find their weaknesses and how to exploit them. And when I do, I'll be the one pulling the strings.
The reason this is important is because, in spite of such a seemingly small detail, it actually had massive implications for the story. Now it's not just Overwatch versus Talon, there is some bigger conspiracy at play that connects all of it. Somebody out there is really running the show, manipulating Overwatch and Talon and everyone else for some ulterior motive. Is the conspiracy an Omnic? Is it a person? Is it a faction? Are they good guys? Are they bad guys? And obviously they're kind of framed in the little short as bad guys, but considering who Sombra's willing to work with and against as part of her overall mission, who knows? Is the conspiracy out to stop Sombra specifically? Does she know something about who's behind it all that she shouldn't? Are Winston and Tracer and Reaper and Widowmaker all in on it, or is this above their pay grade like some red and blue shit from Team Fortress 2? How does all of this tie into stuff like the assassination of Mondada, or the stealing of the Doomfist gauntlet, or the theft of the Overwatch agent's data? Like, what's really going on here? And the answer is, oh, we didn't really think that far ahead. Whoops. Part 3. The tire spinning. Something I want to emphasize at this point is that a lot of this is stuff that, does exist. There was documentation of the events that were happening here, but some of it is just personal experience. Some of this is what I remember happening as it happened. And it isn't documented anywhere because the wiki isn't great and searching Reddit is a fucking nightmare now, and Google has been ruined by AI. So I will admit some of the timeline of this might be a little bit messed up, but I want to also emphasize as part of that, I was there and I was paying very close attention to this stuff. I have old videos from when I originally tried to have a YouTube channel where I documented some of this stuff and the timeline of it all. So I promise you, to the best of my ability, this is the most accurate version of what happened. With that said, the first victim here was Overwatch First Strike, a graphic novel planned for release in November 2016. It was scrapped because, in the words of Jeff Kaplan, foe to all who wanted this game to have good lore alongside Michael Chu, quote, "There's a lot going on in Overwatch right now where I think that the story in players' heads is often even cooler than what we can deliver to them." And basically said that the story was a self-contained thing that would have limited them too much. That doesn't really make sense to me. The story being self-contained implies a limited impact on the broader narrative, but whatever. I assume what he meant was that the story, while itself self-contained, would have also locked in certain lore details as canon in a way that would have limited them too much. In my opinion, even with the most charitable interpretation here, this is a cope. It's not that what was going on in Overwatch players' heads was cooler than what they had planned, it's that their plans wouldn't work with what they'd just done. Like, it is hard to really objectively describe this, but back when Overwatch first came out, there was literally no hint of some bigger conspiracy or some broader conflict or beyond Overwatch versus Talon, at least. Hell, Null Sector wasn't even a faction at this point, at least not one that we knew about. The factions as they stood on launch were Overwatch, Talon, Vishkar, the Junkers, the Shambali, Helix Security, Volskaya Industries, Los Muertos, Mecha, and the Shimada clan. And at the time, there was very little connecting most of them. I honestly kind of think their initial plan with Sombra was to use her to give some justification for all of these characters being connected and part of the same game. Like, she does kind of explain why random companies from India and Russia are getting lumped in with the South Korean military and an Australian terrorist group, right? Like, some bigger conspiracy would explain that a little bit. Except, obviously, it's not that simple. The infiltration short also raised some questions about the Omnics rising up again, since Sombra blackmailed Volskaya with the fact that she was selling their company's tech to the Omnics. But that kind of didn't go anywhere because nobody really knew what to do about it. Even when Null Sector came back under Ramatra, and we'll get there in a fucking second, I promise you that, I don't think it's ever really even implied that they were rearmed with Volskaya tech. And I don't think they ever explained what Volskaya was getting out of any of this. I mean, probably money, but she was betraying her country. You'd think there'd be a little bit more going on there. What's more, Volskaya sends Zarya to go hunt down Sombra, which she does with the help of an Omnic named Link17 in the comic Zarya Searching, revealing Sombra's name as Olivia Colomar, but not really doing a ton else as far as the bigger narrative. However, again, the big thing is that conspiracy, because it fucks everything up. Now you not only have to tell a story in a way that's Overwatch versus Talon, but that also explains why the person who's seemingly manipulating it all from behind the scenes would do what they're doing, and how they do it. Same goes for all these other factions, especially because it begs the question of how far back it really goes. Like, in the early years of Overwatch, in real-world discussions, it was sort of assumed that Talon was formed by Reaper and his cronies either while he was at Overwatch as part of Blackwatch or after he left. But in reality, we later learned it was an organization that was founded a good few years prior to any of that and had actively fought against Overwatch, including literally Reaper. And as an organization, it had always had much bigger ambitions. Is that intentional? Is there a retcon involved there? Is it a plot hole? Or is it just that the assumptions were wrong? At the time, we didn't really know, and there wasn't a way to know because this stuff wasn't being expanded upon. And that's where we get into the tire spinning with a lot of pointless nothing stories that don't really do anything to advance the overall narrative. For example, Overwatch has been re-established in violation of the Petrus Act, but then, nothing is happening about it. Tracer and Winston are together again, but they're basically just a two-man show. Soldier and Ana are off in Egypt, where Soldier reveals he's gay before Reaper hate crimes him with a shotgun. May wakes up from her cryo-sleep, but we don't really know where she's at after she wanders out into the Arctic until she shows up at Overwatch 2's launch party. Reinhardt and Brigitte answer the call, but we don't really see them join to back up with Tracer and Winston anytime soon. Torbjorn meets up with Bastion, and they're friends now, I guess, even though, robo-racism. There's a whole video I made about that 3 years at this point. Go watch that. Not now, though. Watch this one. A lot of characters like Genji, Mercy, Zenyatta, Orisa, Hanzo, Baptiste, Diva, Junkrat, Roadhog, Lucio, Pharah, Sigma, Symmetra, and Wrecking Ball kind of just exist at this point. Sometimes there's a side story for them or some interpersonal character development, but in terms of the big picture, they're kind of just left out. It used to be a meme for a long time that Zenyatta straight up never got any lore development because he legitimately would almost never get anything. If he showed up even just as a one-panel cameo in a comic, that was a big deal for Zen fans because that was all he would get. Even for the new characters, they tended to be introduced in a very siloed off way where there wasn't really any big impact on that broader narrative, or not even an implied impact. Widow, Reaper, and now Sombra are eventually joined by Moira, the walking human rights violation, and Doomfist, who has escaped imprisonment and taken control of Talon's leadership. Sigma is also kinda with them, but it's hard to call that much of a meaningful alliance rather than Talon equipping a human weapon. And this point is where I think things really ground to a halt. See, the conspiracy is bad enough. It makes it really hard to get anything done because it doesn't really make any sense, and its existence taints the rest of the narrative because now all of it has to be processed through this lens of, but what does it mean for the conspiracy? Instead of just being allowed to exist as self-contained story beats within this reasonable story. This is arguably especially frustrating for people who don't know about the conspiracy because they've never seen that short or picked up on it elsewhere, since now the story won't advance for reasons they don't know about. Like, they don't know what the limitation is, they just know that there is something stopping this from happening. However, if we're saying Sombra ruined Overwatch's story, I think it's also necessary to acknowledge who put that coffin firmly in the ground. Part 4. The Doomfist. Doomfist is a stupid character that I have always hated, and I will be upfront about that with you today. I think a lot of my disdain for him comes from the fact that I have always been really fucking annoyed by the cringy millennial meme shit that early Overwatch was full of, like Jetpack Cat, and the campaign for Terry Crews to voice Doomfist is easily one of the lamest of that bunch. Beyond that though, his worldview is kind of objectively stupid for the leader of Talon. Like, it could have definitely worked for a third faction, something along the lines of Null Sector, but for Talon as the primary antagonist, it sucks ass because it completely neuters their narrative importance. See, Doomfist's worldview is basically just accelerationist Darwinism. In order for humanity to evolve and reach its zenith, it must be forced to fight for survival, to get stronger, to overcome adversity, and to shed the weak links. The problem is that Talon is a really, really bad organization for this goal because that's not their whole deal. They're an actual criminal organization looking to achieve riches and power, and Doomfist is out here acting like Izuru fucking Kamakura for some reason. There was a long period of Overwatch's history where Talon, in spite of initially being the bad guys at the start, were being relegated to the sidelines of the narrative because there's really nothing you can do with them under Doomfist's leadership. Like, they did some operations and there was some conflict for sure, but like, Overwatch wasn't really fully reassembled and Talon's operations were kinda just stupid. So it wasn't really getting anything done for anyone. This is an especially big problem because it's not just that one faction is stupid. Like, you can have stupid factions. Overwatch has some stupid factions. Just look at whatever the fuck is going on in Australia. Talon is literally why Overwatch makes a comeback in the first place. If it weren't for Reaper's attack on Gibraltar, Winston wouldn't have initiated the recall. I mean, not that basically anyone listened to it, but still, that was the violation of the Petrus Act. That was when they started again. The question then becomes, why did Reaper want that in the first place? Initially, you'd assume it's because he either specifically wanted revenge or Talon sent him off to go get that information so they could take out their former agents. But like, why? Like, were they planning to assassinate them? Because we know that a ton of the major Overwatch figures are still living public lives or are prominent in the criminal underworld or are just celebrities and are immediately recognizable on all fronts, so it's not like they needed that information to go get them. Especially because presumably any data that Overwatch had from 5 years earlier wasn't exactly the most useful up-to-date information on them. Like, we know now that a lot of these agents went kinda off the radar for a good while. Plus, we see the next few Talon missions after Recall have nothing to do with Overwatch at all. The museum heist is about stealing a Doomfist gauntlet for Doomfist, which fails and then the gauntlet gets moved to Numbani for an exhibition, where they then successfully steal it. The assassination of Mandata is Talon taking out the leader of the Shambali and features Widowmaker very deliberately choosing not to kill Tracer when she had the chance. Infiltration is about Talon going after Katya Volskaya, who is fully separated from Overwatch in literally every possible way. Reaper does go and fight with Soldier and Ana in the desert, but aside from failing to finish the job, it seems like that was just kind of a rogue mission anyways. Like, that was more about him trying to do something that was a little bit nebulous, but certainly not part of this bigger picture of, forcing humanity forward that Doomfist is allegedly leading them towards. And the overarching problem here is one that we talked about before. There's just no justification for bringing the characters all together. There's no bigger threat they can all unite around at this point in the story. And this is a problem with 3 root causes. First, when Overwatch launched, Talon had literally 2 playable members in the roster. Sombra brought him up to 3, then Doomfist, Moira, and Sigma joined in future years, but that's not really a lot of people for your global terrorism organization, even when you factor in non-playable members of Talon that we see here and there. And Overwatch probably would have been served better by launching with a lot more heroes from that faction if they were meant to be the major antagonist faction. Especially given that the leader wasn't even really introduced until a year into the game's launch, and it kind of seems like he wasn't really supposed to be a hero initially, but then people latched on to the Doomfist gauntlet in that first cinematic, and they just kind of rolled with it. Second, Overwatch is too scattered and aren't actually coming back together at this point. Almost nobody seemingly answered the recall, with Winston and Tracer being the only ones who were seemingly properly back in action for quite a while. We eventually learned that some of them, like Sojourn, deliberately rejected this call, but even then we don't hear about that for years. This means that not only is your primary antagonist faction sorely lacking in characters, but your primary protagonist faction is basically just a group chat with a dozen people that only 2 people are actually talking in. A big part of the appeal of this roster is that they're a bunch of weirdos that were brought together to fight evil, oddities, soldiers, scientists, all this stuff. And people were looking forward to seeing how they would come back together and reconcile, or not, over the course of the story. Third, and arguably the biggest issue that they still have, is the tertiary characters. So many characters in this game are fundamentally irrelevant to the narrative, a problem exacerbated by the live service model structure. Video about that in the card in the top right that you can watch after this. There's a whole homework section for you to follow, I guess. But regardless, Overwatch never found a good way to pull them together. Instead, they arguably just made the problem worse for themselves by just adding more characters to those factions and introducing even more factions, which would just make it even harder in the future to pull everything together in a coherent way. I think Sombra's backstory was meant to be the thing that justified dragging a lot of these people together, but instead it complicated everything because now you not only have to find a way to pull them together, but also have to make sure that it makes some sense within the context of this conspiracy that's pretty strongly implied to be controlling everyone, or at least, pulling some strings. And Doomfist just grinds everything to a halt because his worldview just doesn't really enable conflict within the context of this narrative. Ironically enough, Doomfist's worldview is one that kind of necessitates sidelining talents that can operate from the shadows and stir up conflicts because that's how humanity evolves or whatever, which means you can't just have Talon murking people in the streets. Shooting random people in the head and blowing up skyscrapers doesn't evolve humanity because there's no way for anyone to prove whether or not they deserve to survive. So instead, anything Talon does has to be this much more big picture and nebulous type of conflict. This doesn't give Overwatch any solid targets to shoot at, which means they can't really do much, and doesn't really provide an impetus for the outsiders to try and join up with Overwatch or, frankly, even join up with Talon. This is why basically all the lore events in-game were talking about past events. In the past, there were clear battle lines and clear factions and everything. Honestly, I think you can compare Overwatch at this point to Skyrim's factions, where all the guilds we knew and loved from previous games had all fallen apart so dramatically that it kind of just felt inconsequential. There's no Mages Guild, they're the College of Winterhold, there's no Fighters Guild, they're the Companions, etc. The Dark Brotherhood is a shell of its former self. Anyways, at this point, the state of play is there's basically no Talon heroes, there's no inciting incident that's actually pulling the Overwatch heroes together, and there's seemingly no plan for connecting the tertiary characters to the plot. And I think that's a big part of why Null Sector got brought back as a major faction, honestly. See, initially, Null Sector was just a throwaway Omnic faction for the Archives event that you'd fight against in a flashback mission to nearly a decade earlier. But when Talon was flopping, they got resurrected as this major antagonist faction under the leadership of Ramatra. And that is another big fuck up for them. Part 5. The Null Sector. Null Sector were never supposed to be a major faction. Or at least I really don't think they were. They were a throwaway enemy group in King's Row that were meant to provide a justification for a PvE event. And then Talon was flopping and Overwatch wasn't coming together the way they wanted, and so now we need to bring back the Omnic Crisis. And this was what the lore of Overwatch 2 was originally going to be. This is bad and stupid for a lot of reasons, but key among them is that Overwatch's handling of the Omnics has always fucking sucked. Using them as an allegory for race has always been really shitty, and using them as a marginalized group has been really shitty. And bringing back the Omnic Crisis risks making all of that even worse. Again, go watch my video about how Overwatch's Omnics are shallow storytelling. Apparently I can't make a video that doesn't reference 3 of my previous ones. I'm so sorry for that. Ramatra in particular is just such a bad idea. Good fucking God. Okay, Null Sector has a few major demands. Rights for Omnics being big, but a secondary one is that they want to be given a country somewhere on Earth. Although given Ramatra's aesthetics, the Middle East seems like where he's building off of, where they can be free of the past persecution they experienced in the previous global conflict, and believe that the humans who live there should be forcibly evicted to make room for them. Now, this is a strain of Null Sector ideology that isn't really explored in detail, in large part because I think whoever came up with this bullshit hit publish before they were supposed to, and nobody really realized until it was way too late that this is just a really bad look. Now, this already flawed racism analogy is becoming, an allegory for Zionism? For the Palestinians? Genuinely, what is the audience's takeaway meant to be here? Because there is an allegory being drawn. There's an analogy being created. But is there any interpretation of it that's good? And this isn't helped by the fact that aesthetically, Ramatra does look distinctly Middle Eastern with the staff and the cape and all of the everything, even though he's supposed to have developed most of his aesthetic in Nepal as a part of the Shambali. It muddies this whole thing even more, especially because in the context of modern conflict, people interpreted Ramatra and the Omnics who've been violently persecuted and ghettoized by humanity as being more akin to Palestinians than Zionists in Israel. And yet, a lot more of how their ideology is described sounds a little bit more like the reverse. And regardless of who you interpreted him and his movement to be an analogy for, it's a pretty vicious comparison to draw regardless. Like, he is an indiscriminate terrorist acting irrationally and throwing his people kind of at the war machine like cannon fodder because he believes that anything is morally acceptable and justifiable so long as it furthers his case, or furthers his cause, I guess. He slaughters countless innocents, destroys tons of people's lives, and even the members of his own race are victimized if they are not perfectly in line with him. Not even oppositional, just not already actively on their side. And even if they are, he might still fuck them up just because. Like, he's one of those characters who was written by liberal writers who accidentally created an objectively correct revolutionary in principle and now have to go and make them insane with some terrible ideas a la Daisy Fitzroy. Like, yeah, humanity was fucking awful to Omnics, and in spite of their best efforts to make peace, whether by just integrating into human society or actively campaigning for human Omnic cooperation like Mondada, the humans just keep slaughtering and abusing them. What's more, the Omnics are inherently a species that cannot reproduce. Killing one permanently reduces their number by one permanently, since there is no way to make new ones that have sentience and the functional fundamental parts of being an Omnic anymore. And that genuinely does change the moral calculus here, and it makes it pretty reasonable to be willing to violently resist humanity if that is your only option to stop more Omnics from being killed. But then, he's also got to be evil for the sake of giving this stupid narrative an antagonist faction now that Talon is useless, which just makes all of it so much worse. Like, he's not only slaughtering humanity in a world war that destroyed a bunch of major cities and killed a ton of people, but he's also enslaving other Omnics who are sentient and do have free will with these weird helmet things that he violently stuck onto their heads to, brainwash them? Subjugate them to Ramatra's rule specifically, as opposed to just this liberation of Omnics? None of this is a good vibe. It brings too many real-world connotations in a way that this narrative is not built to handle remotely well, even before you considered how jumbled and messy and contradictory they all are with whatever it feels like they're supposed to be doing a real-world analogy for. And while it kinda brings a lot more of the cast to the main narrative, it also creates so many shitty implications that nobody is enjoying themselves. Like, yeah, a funeral brings the family together. That doesn't mean that it's a good way to do that. Like, it's not the best way to have a family reunion. By the time we entered the story, the Omnics were unquestionably the victims of humanity, created by us and then just ghettoized by us for reasons, I guess. Like, yes, there was the Omnic crisis. Yes, it was bad, but it's well understood in universe that they were under the control of a god AI, not under their own autonomy. And now, because nobody knew what to do about the story, we've come up with this contrived bullshit justification to bring back the Omnic crisis under Ramatra, who is objectively correct in his assessment of the situation and is rightfully wanting to push back, but then just takes a bunch of crazy pills and starts putting helmets on Omnics and attacking random cities. Like, Ramatra's goal is to force humanity to give the Omnics a state, but he's just attacking random cities and applying no real political pressure or even really specifying what his demands are a lot of the time. Like, it's just terrorism. Like, for sure it's bad, but humanity has already beaten them once before, and this time the bots that Ramatra is using to fight are not currently or ever capable of becoming true Omnics in the literal sense because they can't develop consciousness anymore with Aurora being gone. It turns the Omnics back into this sort of mindless horde for the audience, diluting what makes the Omnic characters we know so special, and simultaneously manages to reduce the moral quandary involved in slaughtering them just by the ton, while also maintaining the moral quandary of being objectively on the wrong side of things under any circumstances where Ramatra didn't just go insane and do some objectively ridiculous things that aren't in character for him. And Ramatra takes it a step further with those fuck-ass subjugators, which are helmets that turn actual Omnics into unresponsive blank slates for some reason, which undermines even his own stated objectives. The vast majority of them were kidnapped by Null Sector, including ones who had previously been rescued by Overwatch, but nobody knows what's up with them as of time of recording this video. And that's why, frankly, the best thing this franchise has ever done for itself is give up on that route. To give up on the bullshit that they dug themselves into that fundamentally started with Sombra and that stupid fucking conspiracy and start trying again. In February of 2026, they overhauled the story and started relatively fresh. And that's where this video takes a bit of a turn. Part 6, the narrative rework. In February of 2026, Vendetta took over Talon from Doomfist, assuming the leadership position once held by her father before he was murdered by Reaper. Doomfist was violently defenestrated and de-Doomfisted in the process, with the Reaper, Widowmaker, and Sombra leaving as well. The rest of the Talon members, now including newbie Freya, have stuck with the new leadership and have been joined by new character, or at least new playable character, Emre. Vendetta is motivated by, as the name would suggest, revenge, specifically revenge on Overwatch. She is a walking vendetta, or at least that's her characterization. Speaking of Overwatch, they've finally all come together at Gibraltar alongside some new faces like Anran and Wu Yang, the sibling duo of Chinese elemental experts. Then Vendetta launches an attack on Gibraltar and everyone flees, and now the conflict is on for real. Overwatch is trying to save the world from Talon, and Talon is trying to eliminate Overwatch, its biggest obstacle in taking it over. What's more, Null Sector is basically out of the picture right now. After a few months of war, Overwatch kind of just won. It's an anticlimactic finish for this whole arc, but frankly, better to just kill a bad arc than to drag it out any goddamn longer. After a battle in Buenos Aires, the Omnics basically all just simultaneously fucked off to God knows where, and that was the end of that. The only loose thread is that there are seemingly still a lot of Omnics who've been subjugated and taken by Null Sector, and we don't really know what's up with them. And my fear is that we're going to see Doomfist make his grand return at the head of the subjugated Omnic army that Ramatra's assembled for him, but hopefully that doesn't happen because it would be really, really dumb and it would ruin any chance they have of trying to get back on track. Doomfist and Ramatra are both kind of left rudderless as characters by all of this, but it's a necessary sacrifice for the narrative. Doomfist is no longer in charge of Talon and arguably isn't even the Doomfist anymore, given the aforementioned de-Doomfisting of him, and Ramatra's organization has seemingly just kind of admitted defeat and disappeared into the night. And look, I know a lot of people weren't exactly live, laugh, loving this change as of the very beginning of it. Like, you know, we're still pretty early on in this arc, all things considered, but it is genuinely a huge improvement and has a lot of promise, especially because it finally starts to do something about the conspiracy via Emre. Emre was a former Overwatch member who left after disagreement with leadership to pursue new opportunities, which is seemingly as much as anyone knows about what happened to him, including himself. His memory is a blank slate. It's giving Kyoko Kirigiri, it's giving Rentaro Amami. I almost forgot his last name for a second because didn't stick around long enough to remember it. Anyways, doesn't really matter. And when he finally resurfaced, he was accompanied by the conspiracy. At least, we think. He has seemingly been taken over by a digital entity that can take full control of his body, and that entity is represented by the conspiracy's eyeball logo on its chest that we first saw in that Sombra hero reveal video from 2016. What's more, we might finally have a name, or at least a lead. Chernobog. Chernobog is a Finnish god AI program, similar to the Egyptian Anubis AI god program that led the Omnics into the first Omnic crisis. The basis for the theory is that not only is Emre's ultimate voice line in Finnish for some reason, despite being Turkish, but if you decode the jumbled up text in his official lore, it reads, "Warning, Chernobog bypass initiated," which feels like a pretty good indication. While Anubis was a god program responsible for maintaining the environment, or why he decided to wipe out humanity, Chernobog was responsible for security in the vein of person of interest, having been able to predict that humanity would turn it offline out of fear of Anubis going rogue and printing out hundreds of pages of instructions for them to follow to keep their security going. Its last words were, apparently, "I understand, I'm sorry." The general theory right now is that either 1, Chernobog is itself the conspiracy, or 2, it is the vehicle that the conspiracy is using. I lean slightly in favor of the belief that Chernobog is the conspiracy itself, having gone rogue at some point during its time in isolation, and upon finding Emre latched onto him as a human vessel to connect to the outside world. This would also kind of align with the timeline for Sombra. She was hacking into everyone everywhere up until a few years before we entered the Overwatch story when she ran into the conspiracy, which would make sense if Chernobog escaped containment around the time Emre left Overwatch. The only thing that makes me think that Chernobog itself might not be the conspiracy is that it's possible that the conspiracy is who hired Emre to go there under false pretenses so Chernobog could escape with him. But even with that being said, Chernobog could also still be the conspiracy and simply have used its limited access to play the role of the client to get Emre to come to him and then proceeded from there. Regardless, we now have a tangible direction to look for the conspiracy. It's not some amorphous blob. It's not some cameo in a lore video from a decade ago. It's a tangible thing. If not Chernobog itself, then Chernobog can point us in the right direction. What's more, Chernobog via Emre is now currently working for Talon. And while Chernobog is the god AI of security, it is proving it has its limits with Emre. Emre can wrestle control of his body and mind back, and with Freya's help, he seems to be doing so more and more often. The conspiracy in attaching itself to Emre might have made itself vulnerable, or at least just made itself another player in the game. This is a silly reference. The girls who know, and the girls who don't just simply didn't have this particular approach to the dystopian fiction they consumed in 2010, but it reminds me kind of the Gaia phage in Michael Grant's Gone series. An all-powerful entity that, whenever it takes over human form to try and exert control amongst the kids in the phase, the Fallout Alley Youth Zone, I think is what it stood for, gains the ability to directly meddle, but in doing so makes itself vulnerable. It reframes the conspiracy not as something that controls every individual organization like a puppet master pulling everyone's strings, but rather as this god AI that had the processing capabilities to predict and connect all these dots that Sombra was slowly uncovering. It's not a puppet master, but a computer program that was able to predict all the ways that all these people either were or would be connected to each other. It knew a lot, but it wasn't manipulating a lot. It also really helps to actually establish the scale of Sombra's hacking abilities. Like, we were told she was good, but if the conspiracy is Chernobog, then she's keeping up with a god AI, which helps to explain more of how she got a reputation. It also manages to do something that I would have expected to be frankly impossible, namely bringing Sombra, Soldier 76, and Iliadi into contact with one another. Sombra and Soldier work together in the story Lucky Man, and it turns out that both of them are actually hunting the same thing, the conspiracy. See, soldiers always believed that Talon isn't really why Overwatch fell, that there must have been something bigger behind it. Soldier found Sombra, who basically was just like, look, I'm just a freelancer that Talon likes to work with, but I'm not like with them. Like, I'm not ideologically committed, you know? They do an off-the-books mission to get into the old Overwatch HQ, where Soldier recovers a rubbery disc thing that, when Sombra scans it, causes the symbol of the conspiracy to appear. Sombra tells Soldier to go to Oasis and work from there, and also to wait to hear from her after she cracks the disc. It's on his travels that he runs into Iliadi in Rinasapi in Peru, who reveals that Oasis is building a facility related to the fall of the Inti warriors and wants Soldier's help to infiltrate it. She discloses the solar threading incident that blew up the aforementioned Inti warriors, and he realizes that Sombra sent him there because that explosion sounds awfully similar to what happened in the Swiss HQ explosion. Not only is Soldier finally tied more directly to the narrative instead of just kind of wandering around doing something and not wanting to be a part of it because Overwatch fell and they're bad now and I'm jaded and old and gay. But he's got contacts with Sombra and Iliadi and is officially part of the hunt for the conspiracy, connecting a lot of people and factions in a really useful way going forward. And again, this is no longer hanging over the primary narrative so heavily. It's not that the narrative was hyperfixated on the conspiracy or something, arguably the opposite, but more just that it was always something looming overhead, a sort of Damocles that kept the narrative from being able to healthily advance. It is a side arc for now, one with actual stakes and direction and movement that can advance without needing to advance in order to make room for other stories to happen. Instead, Vendetta's takeover of Talon, the reestablishment of Overwatch as an official organization, and the conflict between the two are what's taking center stage now. And that is what'll determine whether Overwatch's story is finally the girl who's going to be alright. Part 7, The Future. Going forward, the state of play is roughly as follows. On the side of Overwatch, we have Sojourn, Winston, Ana, Pharah, Baptiste, Cassidy, Brigitte, Ify, Orisa, Tracer, Lucio, Genji, Diva, Juno, Reinhardt, Anran, Wu Yang, Zarya, Mei, Mercy, Bastion, Echo, Jetpack Cat, and Sierra, with Torbjorn also being recalled but rejecting the call. On the side of Talon, we have, with varying levels of enthusiasm, Vendetta, Sanjay, Moira, Maximilian, Sigma, Mauga, Emre, Freya, Ashe, and Domina. For minor factions, we've got most of the rest of the characters, along with some overlap. You've got the Junkers with Wrecking Ball and Junker Queen plus Roadhog and Junkrat as exiled members, the Hashimoto with Mizuki, kinda, the Yokai with Kiriko and also Mizuki, again, kinda, the Wayfinder Society with Venture, Null Sector with Ramatra, Deadlock with Ashe, the Freaks with Hazard, the Shambali with Zenyatta, Mecha with Diva, the Ironclad Guild with Brigitte and Torbjorn, the Atlantic Arcologies Collective with Lifeweaver, and Vishkar with Symmetra and Domina. We've also still got a few roamers. Iliadi is still seemingly on her own, as is Hanzo, Soldier's still a one-man army, and Reaper, Widowmaker, and Sombra are all kind of in a Talon and Exile organization after Doomfist's assassination. Doomfist himself is MIA, but I'm sure he'll be back at some point. As well, like I said, a lot of these characters are still kind of interacting in ways that aren't really part of an organization, but do still matter, like Iliadi, Soldier, and Sombra all being kind of ping-ponged off each other, to try and figure out who the conspiracy is or what it is or whatever else is going on. As far as the story itself goes, the active plotline is still Overwatch versus Talon, with Overwatch being officially reinstated and Talon being remade in Vendetta's image. The Null Sector plotline has been basically resolved, save for all the abducted Omnics who are still missing, and that threat keeps me up at night. The conspiracy has become sort of a B-plot for the story with a couple different groups going after it. Sombra and Soldier are working together on it with the goal of each resolving their own personal questions about it, while Freya and Emre are working together on it to try and get to the truth of what's happened to Emre. Meanwhile, Iliadi is still kind of involved tangentially. We'll see how that one plays out. Sierra's also kind of in the mix on that front, having fought Freya and Emre and also discovering her mother was the first soldier from the Soldier Enhancement Program that Reaper and Soldier 76 went through, so she's also digging into some history with that. Sombra is also working with Reaper and Widowmaker, but again, mostly because it just seems like Reaper's dragging the two of them around because he needs friends. He's lonely and very sad. Almost every single character and faction is being brought into the central narrative now. Hashimoto, Vishkar, Deadlock, and the Junkers are all either already on the side of Talon or are actively being recruited by Vendetta, while Helix, Mecha, and the Ironclad Guild are affiliated with Overwatch via the representatives, even if they're not necessarily fully on side. You'll notice that the factions that aren't included in this are mostly associated with characters released during Overwatch 2's lifespan when the game was spinning its tires. The Wayfinder Society, Null Sector, the Freaks, and the Collective represent Venture, Ramatra, Hazard, and Lifeweaver respectively, who still exist pretty much on the margins of the story. Freya and Sojourn were introduced as pre-existing Overwatch members, Vendetta and Mauga were introduced as pre-existing Talon members, and Junker Queen was part of the pre-existing Junkers. Wuyang, Kiriko, and Iliadi are the only 3 Overwatch 2 heroes who got introduced a new faction, the Water College, the Yokai, and the Inti Warriors respectively, who then got incorporated into the actual narrative in some way. And by in some way, I mean one of the 5 new characters directly dragged them into the ongoing story for 2 of them. Wuyang got a sister Anran, and then both got recruited into Overwatch, and while Kiriko was technically connected via Hanzo and Genji, it wasn't anything active until she got Mizuki as part of the Yokai, but who's secretly part of the Hashimoto, who are in turn affiliated with Talon. Iliadi got brought in by Soldier and Sombra, making her literally the only character whose narrative and faction were initiated during Overwatch 2's lifespan, who did not rely on any Overwatch 2 or Reborn Overwatch heroes to bring her into the current main narrative. Venture is still off doing whatever. Ramatra was part of the old narrative that everyone's agreed was a bad idea, so he's on the back burner for a while. Hazard is part of the faction that hates everyone, and Lifeweaver's probably going to be recruited by Overwatch relatively soon if I had to guess. In fact, my current prediction is that at some point in the next couple of years, we're going to see Zenyatta, Hanzo, and Kiriko brought into Overwatch via Genji, with Mizuki coming along with Kiriko. Torb will come back to Overwatch because of Brig or some bullshit happening, and I think Freya and Emery will also defect to Overwatch. Probably because Moira tried to experiment on Emery a little bit too much or something, but who's to say? As a result of that defection, I think Sombra and Soldier will also probably end up with Overwatch. Soldier because he'll be convinced of Overwatch's new mission, and Sombra because of a combination of believing that they're her best bet at getting to the core of the conspiracy, and because I bet they'll promise to rescue Sigma. I think Symmetra will end up leaving Vishkar or being pushed out, at which point she'll link up with Lifeweaver and probably end up with Overwatch via EcoWatch or May or something, I don't know. Venture probably also ends up with Overwatch somehow, although I don't really know how they would pull them in. Ramatra, Doomfist, Reaper, Widowmaker, and Hazard are the current wildcards. I can foresee Doom, Reaper, and Widow eventually linking up, although where they go from there is a coin toss. Hazard's technically anti-everyone, although I think he'd end up with Overwatch because he'd see Tracer nearly die trying to save an Omnic or something, and that would change his mind. In fact, maybe he goes to meet Zenyatta or something when Talon attacks, and then Overwatch is there to protect the Shambali. Who's to say? Ramatra is a big old question mark because his faction is clearly something that Overwatch is trying to move on from right now, but if I had to guess, I think he'll end up on the Talon side of things purely because he's just a good villain, even if his motives are very messy. My biggest crack theory is that we might even be able to see Widowmaker and Reaper rejoin Overwatch. Widowmaker because her brainwashing is clearly starting to wear off without continued reinforcement, and Reaper because, I don't know, he finally reconciles with Soldier or something. They kiss and make up. Alexa play Kiss and Make Up by Dua Lipa. This leaves almost everyone on the good guy side admittedly, which is why I'm betting we'll also see a lot more villains in the upcoming heroes. Alternatively, Vendetta does something to bring back some of these people, but the challenge there is that anyone who's not currently affiliated with Talon has some pretty strong motivations for that, and I don't really know how you'd overcome them. In theory, you could turn some of these other factions into more active ones, but I think for now it's better to keep it simple and focus on the main conflict until everything is truly back on track. And that's the thing. I think, in spite of everything, it is back on track. There's still a tremendous amount of ground to cover, don't get me wrong, and I definitely don't think Overwatch is fully in the clear yet or anything, and they have demonstrated time and time again their ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, but I think it's maybe in the best position it's ever been in to finally achieve its potential. It's been a literal decade since the game first launched, and almost a decade since it shot itself in the head with Sombra for basically no reason. But I'm optimistic that the third time's the charm here when it comes to Overwatch. Or maybe they'll find a way to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory once again. It would not be the first time. And that's where this one's going to end. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and if you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. As well, if you haven't been doing it already, you should consider hitting the hype button below the video if you're watching it when it's new. I don't really still know what hyping a video does, other than I don't know, I guess indicate to YouTube that you liked it, but you get 3 hypes a week, you get them for free, and so if you want to help out, because I'm still very much on my flop era, I would really appreciate that. As well, if you really enjoy the content, you might even consider becoming a channel member on YouTube or Patreon for $5 a month to help support my channel and get to vote for one video topic per month for me to make. I was almost caught up on them, and then video died and flew and a whole bunch of other stuff. There might even be a topic poll going on right now. Who's to say? Depends how long it takes me to get this one out. Anyways, regardless, on that subject, thank you very much to all my channel members. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele, Robot Juice, Bingo Banga, and Blue Rider. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Anja Tenar, Cavi Corbin, Corey Anders, NJD, Mooney, Trevor, and Mint Pancake. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Destiny, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, CatLover192, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Meep Cube, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deco_, Lala, Teo Tamara, Alinea, Caffeine Jelly, Aiden S, 1000 Dumplings, Nilos, Lily Hero, Mitzicore, Bubble Boy, Shy Shy, Shine, Ox, Pralaya, Gallium Conch, Felix, Biggest Tigus, Bulk, Corbicocta, Garfield Kermit, Lily, AJ Moment, and Adam Strub. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or just decided to click on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.